My name is Laura, and at 35 years old, my birthday ended not with cake, but with a text from my brother Mark. He had sold my car to pay off his son's $15,000 debt. This wasn't just any car. It was my mobile clinic outfitted with a $7,000 hand control system for my disabled veteran patients. Don't be selfish, his text ended. He was expecting tears. He had no idea that I was calmly opening a digital journal I'd been keeping for months, documenting every one of his suspicious questions. The trap I had prayed I'd never have to use was about to spring. The trap I'd prayed I'd never need was about to spring. But a few moments before that, there was only silence, the kind of deep, earned quiet that settles over a house after a long day of work. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9, each dong a soft punctuation mark on my 35th birthday. I sank into my favorite armchair, the worn leather sighing under my weight. My feet ached, a familiar feeling after 8 hours of guiding patients through stretches and exercises. It was a good ache, though, the kind that reminds you that you made a difference. A small slice of store-bought chocolate cake sat on the end table, a single unlit candle sticking out of the frosting. My celebration was modest, just the way I liked it. A quiet evening, a chapter of a good book, and then an early night. Tomorrow, my first patient was Mr. Henderson, a Marine veteran who had lost the use of his legs in Fallujah. He lived 30 miles out of town in a small house his son had built for him. Getting there was a challenge for most, but not for me. Not in my car. I reached for my phone, thinking I'd scroll through a few birthday messages from friends before calling it a night. My thumb swiped across the screen, and a new text message glowed at the top. It was from Mark. My heart gave a little flutter of warmth. He had remembered. But the warmth turned to ice as my eyes scanned the words. The sentences were short, brutal. I read them once, then twice, certain my tired mind was playing tricks on me. But the words didn't change. He said he sold my car. He explained that his son Ryan was in some kind of trouble again and needed money fast. He ended with the familiar family mantra, the one that had been used as a weapon against me my entire life. Family helps family. There was no question, no apology. Just a statement of fact, as if he were announcing he'd taken out the trash. I felt the air leave my lungs. A cold dread, heavy and metallic, settled in my stomach. I thought of the title locked safely in my desk drawer, with only my name on it. How could he? Then I thought of the car itself. The spacious interior, the ramp I had installed, the complex $7,000 hand control system that allowed me to drive without using my feet. It was more than a car. It was an extension of my practice. It was a lifeline. My thumb trembled as I pressed his contact number. He answered on the second ring, his voice casual, almost cheerful. I asked him what he meant. I asked him where my car was. His response was flat, devoid of any emotion. He told me a guy he knew gave him cash for it that afternoon. He said Ryan's debt was serious this time, something about $15,000. He told me not to worry, that he'd figure out how to pay me back for it someday. Someday. The word hung in the air between us, a hollow, meaningless promise. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. All I could see in my mind was Mr. Henderson's face waiting by his window for me tomorrow morning. My heart sank. That wasn't just a car. It was my connection to soldiers who had sacrificed so much, and Mark had just severed it. I ended the call without another word and let the phone drop onto the cushioned arm of the chair. My body felt heavy, anchored by a profound sense of violation. It was one thing to be taken for granted, to have my generosity treated like an obligation. I had grown used to that over the years. But this was different. This was an amputation. Mark had not just sold a possession, he had stolen a part of my purpose. My mind drifted back 2 years to the day I finally made the decision. My practice was growing, and with it the number of patients who were homebound. Many were veterans, men and women who had come home from service with injuries that made travel to a clinic impossible. I was driving a standard sedan at the time, struggling to fit my portable therapy table and equipment in the trunk. But the real challenge was the patients themselves. I wanted to serve them, but my ability to reach them was limited. The solution was expensive, a specially outfitted van with a wheelchair ramp and a state-of-the-art hand control system. The modifications alone cost $7,000, a sum I paid for out of my own savings. I remember the day the technicians finished the installation. They showed me the smooth, responsive lever next to the steering wheel, explaining how it controlled the gas and brake. For the first time, I felt like my vehicle was a true extension of my work. It was a mobile medical device, a rolling sanctuary of healing and accessibility. It allowed me to bring not just therapy, but dignity to my patients. I could see the relief in their eyes when they didn't have to endure a painful transfer from their wheelchair to a regular car seat. That vehicle represented my commitment, my investment in the lives of others. And Mark had sold it for cash, to bail out Ryan, again. My brother was a man who lived in a revolving door of self-made crises. A string of failed business ideas, from a smoothie stand that lasted one summer to an online venture selling imported trinkets, had left him in perpetual debt. Each failure was followed by a desperate appeal to our parents, who in turn would look to me, the stable one, the responsible one. Ryan, my nephew, was simply a younger version of his father. He had an allergy to responsibility and a talent for finding trouble. His problems were never his fault, always the result of a bad break, an unfair boss, or a friend who led him astray. The $15,000 was likely a gambling debt, just like the $5,000 from last Christmas. The pieces started to click into place, forming a picture that was uglier than I had initially imagined. I remembered Mark's strange questions from a few months ago. He had called one evening full of uncharacteristic curiosity about my work van. He asked about its value, how much the special equipment cost, if it had a specific resale market. At the time, I thought he was just making conversation, showing a rare flicker of interest in my life. Now I understood. It was not curiosity. It was reconnaissance. The reconnaissance had been more detailed than I'd first realized. My mind replayed a specific conversation from late spring. Mark had called under the pretense of asking for my opinion on a used car he was supposedly considering for Ryan. He steered the conversation not so subtly toward my work with the Veterans Affairs Department. He knew my practice had a contract with the VA to provide in-home physical therapy services. He had started with casual questions. He asked if the VA helped pay for my van. I explained that I was an independent contractor, so the vehicle was my own business expense. Then his questions became more pointed. He asked what happens if essential medical equipment gets damaged. Is it covered by some kind of special insurance? Does the VA have a program to replace it? I remember explaining the basics. I told him that as a contractor I carried my own commercial insurance policy. But for specialized equipment, especially items directly impacting patient care, the VA had a stringent process for reimbursement claims if the damage occurred during the transport of a patient or on government property. It was a bureaucratic maze designed to prevent fraud. That was when he asked the question that had planted the first seed of suspicion in my mind. He asked, what if the equipment was, say, completely destroyed in an accident? Would the VA pay out its full value, and would the process be complicated? His tone was light, almost joking, but his curiosity felt predatory. That night after our call, I felt a knot of unease in my stomach. It was the same feeling I got when a patient described a symptom that didn't quite fit the diagnosis. A sense of dissonance. Something was off. Trusting that instinct, the one honed by years of clinical practice, I opened a new document on my computer. I titled it simply, M. Communications Log. I typed out the date and a summary of our conversation, including his specific questions about VA reimbursement. I did the same for a few other strange conversations we'd had in the preceding weeks. His sudden interest in my work schedule. His questions about whether I kept the van's title at home or in a safe deposit box. Each entry was a small, seemingly insignificant detail. A single data point. But now, sitting in the silence of my living room, those data points were connecting, forming a constellation of deceit. He had not been just planning to sell my van. He had been exploring ways to maximize his profit from it, to extract every possible dollar. The thought sent a chill through me. Had he been planning to damage the equipment and file a fraudulent claim, I had created the log as a defensive measure, a private record, just in case my unease proved to be warranted. It felt almost paranoid at the time, documenting conversations with my own brother. But my instincts, my medical training had taught me one crucial lesson. You document everything that seems out of the ordinary. You note every inconsistency, because those small details can be the difference between a correct diagnosis and a catastrophic mistake. I saved the file and buried it in a folder of old tax records, hoping I would never have to look at it again. Now it was the only thing I could think about. With the cold clarity of my brother's intentions now laid bare in my mind, I knew I couldn't let his statement stand. I needed to hear his voice. I needed to understand the depths of his delusion. I pressed his number again, my hand steady this time, my shock replaced by a chilling resolve. He answered with an audible sigh as if my call was an inconvenience. Before I could speak, he launched into a defensive tirade. He said he didn't have a choice. He said Ryan's situation was life or death, a phrase he used for everything from a traffic ticket to a missed rent payment. He told me he knew I'd be upset, but he also knew I'd understand eventually because I was the only one in the family who had my life together. It was a backhanded compliment, a manipulative stroke designed to both flatter and guilt me into submission. I cut him off mid-sentence. My voice was low, devoid of the hysteria he was clearly expecting. I asked him, "Mark, did you think about Mr. Henderson? Did you think about Mrs. Gable, who can't leave her second-floor apartment without assistance? Did you think about the men and women who are counting on me, who I cannot reach without that vehicle?" There was a pause. For a fleeting moment, I thought I had broken through his wall of self-interest, but his response shattered that hope. He scoffed a short, sharp sound of derision. He told me not to be so dramatic. He said they're just patients. They can reschedule. He said my job was important, sure, but family was more important. Then he delivered the line that would echo in my mind for days to come. He said your brother's son is facing down loan sharks for a $15,000 debt. Your patients are just facing a little inconvenience. Don't be selfish, Laura. Selfish. The word landed like a physical blow. Me, the woman who had co-signed his first business loan, the one who had paid for Ryan's braces, the one who had sacrificed countless weekends and holidays to build a career that ironically had funded more of their emergencies than I could count. I was being called selfish by a man who had just stolen a vital piece of my livelihood, not for a medical emergency, but to erase the consequences of his own son's irresponsibility. The sheer audacity of it left me speechless. He mistook my silence for concession. His tone softened slightly, becoming magnanimous as if he were granting me a great favor. He promised again that he'd pay me back. He said once Ryan was safe and things calmed down, we could all sit down and figure it out like a family. He said he knew I'd do the right thing in the end. He always knew he could count on me. The call ended with his empty promises and my chilling silence. But my silence was not acquiescence. It was not surrender. It was the quiet, methodical calm before a storm. The storm he had no idea he had just steered directly into his own path. In his mind, he had solved a problem. In reality, he had just handed me the very key I needed to lock him out of my life forever. After the call with Mark, a sliver of irrational hope still flickered within me. It was a deeply ingrained instinct, the lifelong habit of a child seeking fairness from her parents. They were the ultimate authority, the final court of appeals in our family's unwritten legal system. Surely they would see the injustice in this. Surely they would not condone grand theft, even if the perpetrator was their son. I took a deep breath and dialed my mother's number. She answered with a weary tone, and I knew immediately that Mark had already spoken to her. She already had her script. I explained the situation, keeping my voice as level as I could, laying out the facts. I told her about the hand controls the patients who were now stranded, the sheer illegality of selling a vehicle that wasn't his. I waited for the explosion of maternal outrage on my behalf. I waited for her to say she would call Mark and demand he fix this immediately. Instead, I was met with a sigh. It was a long, drawn-out sound saturated with a familiar blend of disappointment and martyrdom. She told me she knew it wasn't ideal. She said Mark shouldn't have done it without talking to me first. But then came the pivot, the classic maneuver I knew all too well. She started talking about the pressure Mark was under. She painted a picture of him as a loving father pushed to desperate measures to protect his only son. She reminded me that family is complicated, that sometimes we have to make sacrifices for the greater good. The greater good in this case was apparently Ryan's continued ability to evade the consequences of his actions. I tried to steer the conversation back to the facts. I asked her, "Mom, do you understand that what he did is a crime? He sold my property." Her voice sharpened. She told me not to use such ugly words. She said it was a family matter, not a police matter. She told me I was financially stable, that I was successful. Mark, she explained, had never been as fortunate. It was my duty as the successful one to help lift up the rest of the family. The logic was so twisted, so profoundly unfair, that I felt a wave of dizziness. My success was not a source of pride for them. It was a resource to be tapped. I made one last attempt. I called my father. His response was even more blunt. He dispensed with the emotional manipulation and went straight to patriarchal authority. He said Mark did what he had to do. He told me a man's job is to protect his son. He said my job was to understand and forgive. He ended the call by saying that he and my mother had not raised me to be a selfish daughter. That was it. The final door had slammed shut. It wasn't just Mark. It was the entire system. They had built a system designed to funnel resources, forgiveness, and endless second chances to him while demanding silent, stoic sacrifice from me. They were not just bystanders in Mark's crime. They were the architects of the worldview that made it possible. They were his enablers. And in that moment, as I stood alone in my quiet house, I knew with absolute certainty that I was utterly and completely on my own. The silence from my family was absolute for the rest of the night. There were no follow-up calls, no texts offering a compromise. In their minds, the verdict had been delivered, and I was expected to accept my sentence. I spent the night in a state of suspended animation, too numb to sleep, too exhausted to plan. I methodically canceled my patient appointments for the next day, each call a fresh wave of guilt and frustration. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was a mobile banking alert. A deposit had been made to my checking account. For a wild, irrational second, I thought maybe they'd had a change of heart. Maybe my father had liquidated a savings bond, or my mother had cashed in some jewelry. Maybe they had found a way to undo the damage. Then I saw the amount: $3,000. The memo line contained just 2 words, car money. I stared at the screen, the numbers blurring through a haze of disbelief. $3,000. It was a sum so arbitrary, so insulting, it could only have been calculated by a mind completely detached from reality. My van, with its custom modifications, had a Kelly Blue Book value of close to $20,000. The hand control system alone was worth more than twice what he had just deposited. A few seconds later, a text message from Mark appeared. It was as if he had waited for the banking alert to hit before delivering his justification. He wrote that he had managed to get $18,000 for the van cash. He explained that after paying off Ryan's $15,000 debt, this was what was left over. He even had the audacity to add a sentence that I'm sure he intended as generous. He wrote, "I'll send you a little more each month once I get back on my feet." The casual arrogance of it was breathtaking. He had acted as judge, jury, and executioner over my finances. He had unilaterally decided the value of my property liquidated. It paid off his personal debts with the proceeds, and then presented me with the meager leftovers as if it were a fair settlement. He wasn't just a thief, he was an accountant of his own crime, meticulously itemizing his theft and expecting me to accept his ledger. This wasn't a desperate act anymore. It was a business transaction. He had identified an asset, seized it, and allocated the funds according to his own priorities. My needs, my patient's needs, my professional life. They weren't even a rounding error in his calculation. They simply did not exist. The $3,000 felt like a final act of erasure. It was the price he had put on my compliance. It was the value he assigned to my silence. It was a clear, unambiguous message. This is what you are worth to us. This is all you deserve. The insult was so profound it burned away the last vestiges of my grief, leaving behind a cold, hard resolve. He had just given me a receipt for his crime, and I was going to make sure he paid the full price. I spent the rest of the morning staring at the $3,000 deposit on my banking app. It felt less like a payment and more like a bribe for my silence. A ridiculously low one at that. Every minute that passed, the anger in my chest cooled, hardening into something heavier and more solid. I was past the point of tears, past the point of shouting. I was entering a state of quiet, dangerous clarity. I was trying to decide on my next move when my phone began to ring, vibrating sharply against the polished wood of the kitchen table. I glanced at the caller ID, expecting to see my mother's number, likely calling to ask if I had received the money, and if we could all just put this unpleasantness behind us. But it wasn't her. It was a local number I recognized instantly. It was the Collins residence. My heart lurched. George Collins was one of my most fragile patients, a Vietnam veteran and a double amputee who lived with his wife Mary. I answered immediately, my professional instincts taking over. Mary's voice was thin and frayed with panic. She was apologizing profusely for calling me on my day off, but she didn't know who else to turn to. She explained that George had been attempting a transfer from his bed to his wheelchair. His prosthetic had slipped on the hardwood floor, and he had gone down. Hard. My mind started racing, cycling through a mental checklist of potential injuries. Hip fractures, head trauma, pressure sores. I asked her if he was conscious. She said yes, but he was in a great deal of pain and was unable to move. She was a small woman, and George was not. She explained through panicked sobs that she couldn't lift him, that she was terrified of hurting him further. My first instinctual response was to say, "I'll be right there." The words formed in my throat, but caught before they could escape. Because I couldn't. I was 30 miles away with no way to get to them. A wave of profound helplessness washed over me. I was a healer with no way to reach the wounded. I forced my voice to remain calm, professional. I began walking Mary through a basic assessment over the phone. I had her check his breathing, look for any obvious signs of bleeding or bone deformation. I instructed her on how to place pillows under his head and legs to make him more comfortable without moving his spine. As she was adjusting a pillow near his head, I heard it. A low, guttural sound in the background. It was the sound of a man trying to suppress a cry of intense pain. That sound severed the last thread of familial obligation inside me. This was no longer an abstract injustice. It was not about a stolen vehicle or an insulting sum of money. It was about this man, this hero, lying in agony on his floor because my brother needed to pay off a gambling debt. The harm was no longer just to me. It had spread. It had touched the innocent. I instructed Mary to hang up with me and immediately call 911 to report a fall with a possible hip fracture. I made her promise she would call me back the second she knew anything. After she hung up, I sat in the echoing silence of my home, listening to the phantom sound of a good man's pain. A pain I was supposed to help prevent. In that moment, something inside me shifted, breaking and then reforming into something new and unbreakable. The debate was over. This was no longer about family betrayal. This was about justice. The call with Mary Collins ended, but the echo of George's pain remained. It was the catalyst, the final piece of data I needed to complete the diagnosis of my family's sickness. The time for emotion was over. Emotion was a luxury I could no longer afford. What I needed now was precision. What I needed was a plan. My first step was to manage expectations. My family was waiting for me to break. They were expecting a flood of tearful phone calls, desperate pleas, or perhaps an angry, incoherent outburst. They were waiting for me to play the role of the hysterical woman so they could play their roles as the long-suffering, reasonable parents dealing with an over-emotional daughter. I would not give them the satisfaction. I picked up my phone and sent a single concise text message to a group chat that included my parents and Mark. The message was simple. I wrote, "I need some time to process everything. Please do not contact me for a few days." It was a strategic lie wrapped in a veneer of vulnerability they would easily believe. It would buy me the one thing I needed most: time. Uninterrupted, focused time. Then I walked down the hall to my home office. It was my sanctuary, a room of order and logic filled with medical textbooks, anatomical charts, and patient files. I closed the door, the soft click shutting out the chaos of the last 24 hours. I sat down at my desk, the leather of my chair cool and comforting. The low hum of the desktop computer was the only sound in the room. This was my territory. In this room, I was not a daughter or a sister. I was a professional. I navigated to the folder of old tax records where I had buried the file months ago. I clicked it open. Communications log. The document appeared on my screen, a neat dated list of my brother's probing questions. This was my foundation. I created a new master folder on my desktop, titling it Case File Mark. Then I began to build my case piece by methodical piece. First, I located the digital copies of the van's original bill of sale, and the title both clearly showing only my name. I dragged them into the folder. Next, I found the $7,000 invoice for the hand control installation and the corresponding credit card statement showing the payment. That went in too. I opened my email and began searching. I saved every scheduling confirmation with a veteran patient, every thank you note that mentioned how much the in-home service meant to them, every inquiry about the van's accessibility. Each one was a testament to the vehicle's true purpose, a purpose Mark had dismissed as a mere inconvenience. For hours, I compiled, scanned, and organized. Photographs of the van bank statements showing the insulting $3,000 deposit, my own handwritten notes detailing years of previous financial demands. They thought I was sitting in the dark processing my grief. In reality, I was sitting in the glow of my monitor processing evidence. With a case file growing more substantial by the minute, there was one final crucial piece of information I needed to confirm. It was the darkest suspicion, the one born from Mark's probing questions about VA reimbursements. It felt unthinkable, but my clinical training had taught me to follow the evidence no matter how disturbing the conclusion. My hands felt cold as I typed the web address for the VA contractor portal into my browser. I logged in using my secure credentials, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. The portal was a labyrinth of forms and regulations, but I knew my way around it. I navigated to the section for equipment claims. My own history was clean, a simple list of routine supply orders. Then I accessed the general search function, a tool meant for tracking the status of legitimate claims. I typed in my own contractor ID number and the date range covering the past 3 months. I held my breath and clicked search. The result appeared almost instantly. And there it was, a claim filed just last week, submitted under my name and my ID number. The description read, catastrophic failure of primary driving control mechanism. The amount claimed was exactly $7,000. Seeing it in black and white, an official record of his premeditated fraud was sickening. He hadn't just been thinking about it. He had done it. He had used my identity, my professional standing to attempt to defraud the very system I worked with. He had made me a co-conspirator in his crime without my knowledge. This elevated his betrayal to a level that was not just personal but dangerously professional. If this were discovered by anyone but me, my career, my contracts, everything I had worked for could be jeopardized. That was the final confirmation. There was no going back. There could be no quiet family settlement, no simple repayment plan. He had crossed a line into federal crime, and he had used my name to do it. My first call was not to the police. It was not to the VA. My first call was to secure my own defense and build my offense. I had a former patient, a sharp woman named Eleanor, whose daughter Jessica was a partner at a well-respected law firm downtown. I remembered Jessica telling me once that her specialty was financial litigation and professional malpractice. I looked up the firm's number. I explained the situation to the paralegal who answered, giving a concise, factual summary of the illegal sale, the misappropriated funds, and the fraudulent claim. I didn't let my voice waver. I presented it not as a family drama, but as a complex case of financial abuse and identity theft. The paralegal listened intently, and I could hear her typing. She put me on a brief hold. When she returned, her voice was different, more alert. She said, "Ms. Albright Jessica can clear her schedule to see you. Can you be here at 11 a.m. tomorrow? I confirmed the appointment. As I hung up the phone, I felt a profound internal shift. The victim who had received that devastating text message 24 hours ago was gone. In her place was a plaintiff, a client, a woman who was no longer just reacting to a crisis, but was now actively directing its outcome. The trap, which had been a vague abstract fear in my mind, was now confirmed, and I was no longer waiting for the animal to wander into it. I was about to go hunting. The 48 hours of self-imposed silence I had requested from my family stretched into 72. It was a silence filled with purpose. My meeting with Jessica the lawyer was everything I had hoped for. She was sharp, empathetic, and most importantly, she was furious on my behalf. After reviewing the contents of my case file, she laid out a clear, multi-pronged strategy. But she agreed that the first move should be mine, a controlled, precise strike to gauge the enemy's reaction. On the third morning, I decided it was time. I let the pressure build just long enough. I knew by now my family would be shifting from annoyance at my silence to genuine anxiety. My quiet refusal to engage was a deviation from the script, and it would be making them nervous. I waited until just after 9 a.m., a time I knew Mark would be between jobs, and I called him. He answered on the first ring, his voice a mixture of relief and carefully constructed authority. He said he was glad I was finally ready to be reasonable. He said he and my parents were worried, but they knew I'd come around. He was already framing my return to communication as a surrender. I let him finish. Then I spoke, my voice calm, and measured the voice I used to explain a difficult diagnosis to a patient's family. I said, "Mark, I'm not calling to be reasonable. I'm calling to inform you of your first mistake." The confidence in his voice faltered. He asked what I was talking about. I told him I was referring to the series of conversations we had last spring. I said, "You know the ones where you seemed so intensely interested in my work with the VA. The ones where you asked very specific questions about equipment damage claims and reimbursement procedures." There was a dead silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head, the frantic shuffle of his memory as he tried to recall the details. I continued, my voice still even. I said I just wanted to let you know that I found those conversations unusual at the time. So unusual, in fact, that I kept a detailed log of them. Dates, times, and the specific probing questions you asked. I just thought you should be aware that such a record exists. He finally found his voice, but it was strained, defensive. He sputtered that he didn't know what I was talking about. He said I was making things up, that I was being vindictive and crazy. He scoffed a hollow, unconvincing sound. He told me that some crazy notes I typed up meant nothing. He said it was my word against his. He was right, of course. On its own, the log was circumstantial, but I knew something he didn't. This wasn't the attack. This was just the opening salvo. I had just shown him my knife, but he had no idea I was holding a cannon. He made the first mistake, I thought, and now he's making the second. He's underestimating me. Mark ended the call with a string of angry, dismissive words. He called me delusional. He told me I was trying to blackmail him over nothing. He hung up with a sense of restored bravado, confident that he had called my bluff. He thought he had won the exchange. He had no idea that his denial was the exact reaction I had anticipated. It was the trigger for the second and far more devastating phase of my plan. I waited exactly 10 minutes. Just long enough for his adrenaline to subside and for a seed of doubt to begin sprouting in his mind. Then I called him back. He answered instantly, his voice dripping with irritation. He said, "I told you, Laura, I'm done with this conversation." I replied, my voice still unnervingly calm. "I know you are, but we're not talking about our conversations anymore, Mark. Now we're talking about your actions." He demanded to know what I meant. I took a slow breath. "I said the communication log isn't the problem." "You're right. The problem is the fraudulent $7,000 equipment claim you filed with the Veterans Affairs Department last week, using my name and my contractor identification number." The silence that followed was not like the silence before. This was not the silence of someone trying to remember a conversation. This was the profound, suffocating silence of a man whose entire world had just collapsed inward. The air crackled with his unasked question. How could you possibly know that I answered it for him? I said, you see, that's the beautiful, terrible thing about working as a government contractor. Everything is documented. Every claim, every submission, every keystroke in the portal is logged, dated, and traceable. And when a claim is filed under my name, I get notified. I saw the submission the moment it was processed. He started to stammer a string of incoherent noises. But you... I pressed on my voice like a surgeon's scalpel, precise and cold. I said you thought you were just stealing from me, your little sister. You thought you could bully and guilt me into accepting it, but you didn't just steal my van mark. You stole my professional identity. You used my name to commit a federal crime. And unlike our family's history of sweeping your mistakes under the rug, the federal government tends to take these things very seriously. The sound that came through the phone was not a word. It was a choked, guttural noise, the sound of pure, undiluted panic. The cocky, dismissive man from 10 minutes ago was gone. In his place was a trapped animal, one that had just realized the door to its cage had not only been shut, but locked, bolted, and welded tight. And he was the one who had closed it on himself. The suffocating silence on the phone was finally broken by the sound of a sharp, ragged intake of breath. Then the line went dead. He had hung up, not with a defiant slam, but with the fumbling, nerveless action of a man in deep shock. I stared at my phone, my own reflection, a calm, impassive mask on the dark screen. The first crack in his armor had appeared. Now it was time to watch it shatter. It took less than 20 minutes. A furious pounding erupted on my front door, the sound echoing through my quiet house. It wasn't a knock. It was a frantic percussive assault, the sound of someone whose panic had boiled over into rage. I didn't move from my armchair. I simply picked up my phone, activated the video doorbell app, and watched the scene unfold on the small screen. There he was. My brother, his face blotchy and contorted with a mixture of terror and fury. He was hammering on the door with the side of his fist, his body language screaming desperation. He was shouting my name, his voice muffled but audible through the phone's speaker. He was demanding I open the door, telling me we needed to talk, that I was destroying the family. I did not open the door. I did not answer. My home was my fortress, and I would not allow his chaos to breach its walls. Instead, I spoke to him through the doorbell's intercom system, my voice calm and clear, a stark contrast to his frantic shouting. I said, "Mark, you are trespassing. I suggest you leave my property immediately." My calm response seemed to enrage him further. He started yelling about lawyers and federal prison. He pleaded, then threatened, then pleaded again. He said I was taking everything out of context, that he was just trying to help his son, that I was the one being cruel. He was putting on a performance for an audience of one, but it was a performance being recorded. After a few minutes of his tirade, I saw a curtain twitch in the window of my neighbor's house across the street. Mrs. Gable, a sweet, retired woman, peeked out, her face etched with concern. Mark was so consumed by his own panic that he was oblivious to the public spectacle he was creating. He was no longer a calculating thief. He was just a desperate man coming undone on his sister's front porch. I spoke through the intercom one last time. I said, "Mark, every word you are saying is being recorded. If you do not leave within the next 60 seconds, I will forward this video to the local police department along with a formal complaint." The threat of immediate local consequences finally broke through his panic-induced haze. He stopped shouting. He stared at the small dark lens of the doorbell camera, and for the first time, I think he truly understood. He wasn't dealing with his little sister anymore. He was dealing with a stranger. He backed away from the door, his rage collapsing into a visible, shuddering defeat, and stumbled back to his truck. The louder he yelled, the stronger my evidence became. I watched on my phone as Mark's truck peeled away from the curb, leaving a strip of rubber on the quiet suburban street. The immediate threat was gone, but the war was far from over. His public meltdown, while satisfying to witness, was a symptom of his desperation, not a resolution. Now was the time to press my advantage, to transition from defense to the final decisive attack. My lawyer, Jessica, had prepared me for this exact scenario. We had outlined a series of escalating steps, and Mark's panicked visit had just triggered the next phase. I forwarded the doorbell video to her with a simple one-line message, Phase 2 initiated. Her response came back in less than a minute. Excellent. Proceed with Phase 3. Phase 3 was the ultimatum. It was the moment where I dictated the terms of surrender. I waited another hour, letting the silence and the consequences of his actions marinate in his mind. Then I composed a formal email CCing Jessica's official law firm address. The subject line was stark and professional terms for resolution, regarding asset conversion and fraudulent filing. The body of the email was cold clinical and completely devoid of family sentiment. I stripped our relationship down to its legal components, perpetrator and victim. I laid out the facts without emotion, the date of the unauthorized sale of my vehicle, the documented value, the insulting partial payment, and the date of the fraudulent VA claim filed under my name. Then I delivered the terms. I did not ask. I stated. I gave him a non-negotiable deadline of 48 hours. Within that time, a certified check for the full remaining value of the van, plus an additional $7,000 in damages for professional endangerment and identity fraud, was to be delivered to Jessica's office. The total was precise and unforgiving. I concluded the email with a clear statement of the alternative. If the deadline was missed by even 1 minute, I wrote, I will authorize my legal counsel to forward the complete case file, including the communications log, the doorbell video footage, and all financial documentation, to the Office of the Inspector General for the Department of Veterans Affairs. At that point, all avenues for a private resolution will be permanently closed. This is not a negotiation. It is a final notice. I hit send. The small whoosh sound from my computer speakers felt like a cannon shot. For years, my family had operated on a system of unspoken rules, emotional blackmail, and appeals to a twisted sense of loyalty. I had just replaced that system with a new one, a legally binding contract with catastrophic consequences for non-compliance. For the first time in my life, I wasn't asking for what was fair. I was demanding it. And I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that my brother had absolutely no choice but to comply. The 48-hour clock started ticking the moment I sent the email. I imagined the message landing in Mark's inbox, the cold, legal language stripping away his last remnants of denial. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't my silence of strategic preparation. It was his silence of utter, abject panic. He didn't call. He didn't text. He didn't drive back to my house. He knew that any further communication from him would only serve as more evidence against him. But the silence did not extend to the rest of my family. About 3 hours after my email was sent, my phone rang. It was my mother. I almost let it go to voicemail, but my lawyer and I had discussed this possibility. I needed to remain a firm, consistent wall. I answered. Her voice was not the weary, manipulative tone from before. It was thin, high-pitched, and trembling with a raw fear I had never heard from her in my life. She was crying not the calculated tears of emotional blackmail, but the ragged, uncontrollable sobs of someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing. She said that Mark had come to their house. She said he had shown her and my father the email. She kept repeating the same phrases over and over like a mantra of disbelief. Federal crime. Inspector General. She asked me how I could do this to my own brother, to my own family. She said I was tearing them apart. I listened without interrupting. When her sobs subsided into hiccuping breaths, I responded with the same calm, detached tone I had used with Mark. I said, I did not do this, Mom. Mark did this. He stole from me. Then he used my name to commit a crime against the United States government. These are the consequences of his actions, not mine. She tried to pivot back to the old script. She started talking about forgiveness, about family loyalty, about how Ryan would be devastated. But the words sounded hollow, stripped of their power. The threat of federal prison was a far more potent force than the threat of family disapproval. Through her crying, I could hear my father shouting in the background. His words were muffled, but the volcanic rage was unmistakable. He wasn't shouting at me. He was shouting at Mark. I heard fragments. I heard the words stupid and reckless and you've ruined us. That was the most telling detail of all. Their anger for the first time was not directed at me for setting a boundary. It was directed at Mark for crossing it so spectacularly that he had endangered them all. The shield of the golden child had finally shattered. The son who could do no wrong had done something so profoundly wrong that even their bottomless well of denial could not explain it away. They weren't scolding me for not being selfish. They were terrified of the consequences he had brought to their doorstep. The family unit, once a unified front against me, was now imploding under the weight of his crimes. The people who had once told me to accept the injustice were now cursing the man who had created it. The check arrived at Jessica's office with 3 hours to spare. It was delivered by a courier, a certified bank draft for the exact amount I had demanded. There was no note, no letter of apology. It was the cold, silent transaction of a hostage exchange. My financial freedom for his legal impunity, at least from me. Jessica called to confirm the funds had cleared, and with that, the legal chapter of my ordeal was officially closed. But the social and familial consequences were just beginning to unfold. News of this nature, especially within a close-knit, extended family, does not stay quiet for long. While I maintained my silence, the chaos erupting from my parents' house sent out shockwaves. My aunt, my mother's sister, was the first to call me. Her tone was not accusatory, but cautious, filled with a hesitant curiosity. She said she had heard a wild story from my mother, something about a car and a misunderstanding that had gotten blown way out of proportion. I didn't give her the emotional, detailed account my mother surely had. I simply stated the facts. I said that Mark had illegally sold my medical transport vehicle and then used my professional identity to file a fraudulent claim with the government. I told her that the matter had been resolved legally. The shift in her tone was immediate. The cautious curiosity was replaced by a stunned silence, followed by a quiet, "Damn, Laura!" I had no idea. That was the pattern for the next 2 weeks. Cousins, uncles, and old family friends reached out one by one. The narrative my parents and Mark had tried to spin, one of a selfish daughter punishing her desperate brother, crumbled the moment it was met with the hard, undeniable facts of federal fraud. The community, the very audience my parents were so terrified of, was not turning against me. They were turning against them. The most significant consequence, however, was not the gossip. It was the quiet, independent investigation that my ultimatum had inadvertently triggered. My lawyer informed me that even though I had not filed a formal complaint with the VA, the digital trail of a claim being filed and then never followed up on was enough to raise a red flag in their automated audit system. A junior investigator from the Inspector General's office made a routine call to Mark, a simple fact-finding inquiry about the abandoned claim. Mark predictably panicked under the pressure of an official inquiry. He gave a series of conflicting, nonsensical answers that immediately elevated the routine audit into a formal investigation. I had given him a way out, a path to contain the damage, but in his panic he had poured gasoline on the smoldering embers and lit a match. The justice I had been willing to forego was now coming for him anyway, not with the fire of my anger, but with the cold, methodical weight of the system he had tried to exploit. The check from Mark wasn't a victory prize. It was a refund. It was the closing of a painful chapter, the reimbursement for a debt that was never just about money. I deposited it into my account without ceremony. For a day, I let the numbers sit there, a silent testament to the battle I had won. But I knew this money could not be used for anything ordinary. It was tainted by betrayal, and I was determined to cleanse it, to transform it from a symbol of pain into a source of healing. I didn't buy the same model of van. That vehicle in my mind would always be connected to my brother's deceit. Instead, I invested in a newer, more spacious Model 1 with better accessibility features and a smoother ride. It was an upgrade, a physical manifestation of moving forward. After the purchase and the installation of an even more advanced hand control system, I was left with a significant amount of money. It was more than the $7,000 I had demanded in damages. It was a sum that felt heavy with responsibility. I could have put it into savings or the stock market. I could have taken a long overdue vacation, but none of those options felt right. I thought about George Collins lying on his floor in pain. I thought about the other therapists I knew, dedicated professionals who worked on tight budgets, who often paid for their own gas and equipment just to reach patients in remote areas. The solution became clear. The money wasn't just mine. It belonged in a way to the community that Mark's actions had harmed. I contacted Jessica again this time, not as a victim seeking justice, but as a founder seeking legal advice. I used the remaining funds to establish a small nonprofit foundation. We worked together to draft the charter and file the paperwork. It was a simple organization with a simple mission. I called it the Veterans Ride Fund. Its purpose was straightforward: to provide small grants to independent physical and occupational therapists in our region. These grants would help them cover the costs of vehicle maintenance fuel and the purchasing of specialized equipment for in-home patient care, specifically for low-income veterans. It was a way to ensure that what happened to Mr. Collins, that delay in care due to a therapist's lack of transportation, would be less likely to happen to others. The act of signing the final documents, of seeing the foundation become a legal entity, was more satisfying than receiving the check from Mark. He had tried to take from me, to diminish me, to reduce my life's work to a cash value that could be liquidated for his convenience. But from the wreckage of his selfish act, something new was being built. Something stronger, more generous, and with a reach far beyond what my single van could have ever achieved. He had tried to destroy a part of my purpose. Instead, he had given me the resources to multiply it. A few weeks after the foundation was officially established, I received an unexpected email. It was from Mary Collins, the wife of the veteran who had fallen. The subject line simply read, "A little something." The email was short and warm. She said she had heard from a friend at the VA what I had gone through with my vehicle and what I had chosen to do with the settlement money. She wrote that she and some of the other patient families wanted to do something small to say thank you. She invited me to a potluck dinner at their local community hall that Saturday. She insisted it was very casual, just a few friends getting together. I was hesitant at first. The wounds were still fresh, and the idea of being the center of any kind of attention felt uncomfortable. But there was a sincerity in her message that was hard to refuse. I agreed to come, promising to bring my famous 7-layer salad. When I walked into the community hall that Saturday evening, I realized I had severely underestimated what Mary meant by a few friends. The room was filled. There were at least 50 people there. My patients, both current and former, were there with their spouses, their children, and even their grandchildren. My colleagues from the Regional Therapy Association were there. Even Jessica, my lawyer, was standing in a corner chatting with Mr. Henderson. The room grew quiet as I stood in the doorway, completely overwhelmed. Mary Collins walked up to me, her eyes shining. She gave me a warm hug and whispered in my ear, "We just wanted you to see what real family looks like." The evening was a blur of warmth and genuine affection. People didn't talk about Mark or the lawsuit. Instead, they shared stories. A young veteran told a funny story about how my therapy exercises had helped him finally beat his son at arm wrestling. An elderly woman tearfully recounted how my visits had been the only thing that kept her from despair after her husband passed away. My colleagues presented me with a gas card worth hundreds of dollars, a pooled gift from therapists all over the county. The main event of the evening came after dinner. Mr. Henderson, with help from his son, presented me with a large gift-wrapped frame. When I opened it, I had to fight back tears. It was a beautifully crafted, custom-made metal plaque. Engraved on it was the logo I had designed for the foundation, a simple image of a caduceus with wheels. Below it were the words, "The Veterans Ride Fund, in honor of Laura Albright, who turns compassion into action." They told me it was to mount on the dashboard of my new van. As I stood there holding that plaque, surrounded by the smiling faces of people whose lives I had touched, I finally understood. For years, I had been fighting for a seat at a family table where I was never truly welcome. I had been starving for an affection that was always conditional. In that brightly lit, noisy community hall, I realized I hadn't been an orphan at all. I had a family, a huge, loving, and supportive one. I had just been knocking on the wrong door. The plaque they gave me now sits proudly on the dashboard of my new van. It's the first thing I see when I start my day, and the last thing I see when I finish. It's more than a piece of metal, it's a compass. It reminds me of my true north. My work is not just a job, it's a connection to a community that has shown me more love and respect than I ever received from the people who were supposed to give it unconditionally. A few days after the party, I had my first appointment with George Collins since his fall. I pulled up to his house, the new van gliding smoothly into the driveway. When I opened the side door, the hydraulic ramp lowered with a soft, reassuring hum. George was waiting by the door in his wheelchair, a wide grin on his face. He told me the paramedics had gotten him to the hospital quickly, that he had a badly bruised hip, but thankfully no fracture. He was sore, but he was okay. As I worked with him that morning, guiding him through gentle exercises to restore his strength and confidence, the last pieces of my anger finally melted away, replaced by a profound sense of peace. The entire ordeal had started with a single cruel text message, a symbol of everything I was losing. Now here I was in a better vehicle with a stronger purpose, helping this good man heal. The circle had closed, but the new circle was larger and brighter than the old one. I never spoke to Mark again. I receive occasional filtered updates through my aunt. The VA investigation is ongoing, and his life, I'm told, has been consumed by legal fees and social isolation. My parents remain distant, trapped in a world of their own making, unable to comprehend a reality that doesn't revolve around their son's needs. I feel a distant pity for them, but not a sense of loss. You cannot lose what you never truly had. My life is fuller now. The Veterans Ride Fund has already approved its first 3 grants. My practice is thriving, and my weekends are filled with dinners and get-togethers with the family I chose, the one that chose me back. The journey was born from a painful act of betrayal, but it led me home. Not to the house I grew up in, but to the community I was always meant to serve and to the truest version of myself. Thank you for listening to my story. It's been a difficult journey to revisit, but an important one, and it makes me wonder about the people listening right now. So many of us are taught that family is everything, that loyalty is a debt we must pay regardless of the cost. But true family doesn't issue invoices. Real love doesn't demand you set yourself on fire to keep others warm. I would love to hear from you in the comments below. Let me know where you're watching from and if you've ever had to draw a difficult line in the sand to protect your own peace. Your stories matter, and they remind us all that we are not alone in these struggles. And if this story resonated with you, please take a moment to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who might need to hear it. It helps more than you know. Remember, setting a boundary isn't an act of aggression. It's an act of self-respect. You are worthy of being treated with kindness, and you have the right to build a life and a family that honors your value.